Hi, and welcome to the November 12th edition of Last Week. This week we have some interesting topics. I wanted to kick off with the Ampera-E price hike, and I wanted to follow that session up with, Alex on Autos finally released his review of the Bolt EV, and I wanted to give my feedback on that, but more importantly I wanted to give my feedback on pretty much all auto reviewers right now who are reviewing electric vehicles. And then the other thing is, an interesting question that's been brought up is the heat pump. Is it necessary? And Alex on Autos believes it is, but I might have a different opinion. And then Opel Ampera-E, it's supposed to only get 100 miles of range in the most severe of driving in winter. But I think there's more to it than just that simple number. And then of course, something else that was brought up recently, Robert Llewellyn of Fully Charged reviewed the Shell recharge system that's starting to be deployed in Britain, and that could have interesting implications worldwide, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And then of course we're going to close out the session with our wonderful governor here in California, Jerry Brown, and his take on the U.S. auto industry not being ready for electric vehicles. Well, I hope you enjoy the show, and I'm going to try and keep it brief and topical, and I'd love to hear your comments and feedback, and hope to have some healthy discussions. Okay, so first I wanted to address earlier this week, or earlier last week, there's a notice sent out by Opel, or PSA Group now, that the price for the Opel Ampera-E had increased to the equivalent of about $43,000 US currency. Now that represents about a $5,500 increase over what was originally promised, which was about $37,500. Now the thing is that that original price was announced prior to the Opel brand being sold to PSA. Now, what's interesting about that, though, is Opel or PSA now is pointing the finger at GM, saying it's GM that's increasing the price, and that very well could be. And that's something that I don't like about this. Just to be clear, I don't like the idea of a bait and switch. If customers pre-ordered an Ampera-E in Europe and they were supposed to get it for $37,500, they should get it for that price. But now that the sale has happened between the two different groups, essentially GM would end up selling these vehicles for a loss overseas. And that's something that I think was missed in a lot of the stories that reported this, is the version of the Ampera-E, or the version of the Bolt EV that's sold in Europe as the Ampera-E, is not the same as the base LT model that you would buy in the United States. So while the base LT model in the United States has an MSRP of $36,620 plus another mandatory destination fee that brings it up over $37,000, that's a very bare bones vehicle. The Ampera-E, as it's required to be sold in Europe and as it was set up to be sold in Europe, has a lot more of the features that aren't actually even available in the base Bolt EV LT. And so when you look at the price comparison, what you're getting, including DC fast charging on all vehicles, on all Ampera-E's, you're getting a vehicle that if it were sold in the United States, the MSRP would be closer to $41,000, $42,000. So the price hike actually is really only covering the delivery fees and the actual same cost of equipment that they're putting into the domestically sold Bolt EVs. So I think that's something to consider. But finally, I do think there could be some silver lining in this. This could mean that GM maybe recognizes an opportunity in the European market. So even though they sold their Opel brand, they might be looking to bring their EVs to Europe, which could be, I think, beneficial to everybody, because they have a lot of offerings that would be very popular in Europe, and it's one of the big criticisms I have for the Bolt EV is that it wasn't initially released with a plan for right-hand drive, because I feel like the car would be extremely popular in some of the right-hand drive markets. Okay, so this next section is going to be on a video that was released earlier last week from Alex on Autos. Now, I'll admit I've never seen any of his videos before, but I was actually very impressed, and I'm providing a link below, so go ahead and check it out. I encourage you to. The thing that I liked the most about Alex's review of the Bolt EV is that it was very thorough, and he reviewed a Premier trim, which, you know, and this attests to how thorough it is. He actually pointed out a couple of features that even I didn't realize about the Bolt EV, despite having owned it for a year now and spending, you know, 34,000 miles in it. One of the things is, in particular, they had the cubby for the Premier trim is actually very different than the Bolt EV's LTs, and I'm not sure that I like it better. You have the pouch for the phone, and that I dislike, but then the USB ports and the audio input, the auxiliary input, is actually faced at a different angle, so it's actually easier to access. So there are trade-offs, I think, even between just the design of the center console in the LT and the Premier trim of the Bolt EV. And I agreed with Alex pretty much on everything that he said about the Bolt EV. The stiffness of the ride, but there's a reason for it, the handling, the acceleration and the tires, right? Those are all things that I've seen and I've experienced, and I agree with him fully on. The one point of contention is the heat pump. Now, Alex owns a Kia Soul EV, which comes with a heat pump. The Nissan Leaf famously comes with a heat pump. Some of the Tesla models also include a heat pump, but the Bolt EV doesn't. And I'll talk more about this later, but I'm not convinced that the Bolt EV needs one. I'm not convinced that any large battery electric vehicle needs a heat pump, but that's for another section. The other thing that I disagreed with Alex on, and it's not just Alex, it's the entire community who reviews electric vehicles, is at the end of the segment he has a comparison between the Bolt EV and other electric vehicles, the i3 for instance, or the Tesla Model 3. And the thing is, the i3 is possibly a valid comparison, even though you're really also asking people to shift from a luxury brand to a non-luxury brand and make a, you know, a $5,000 to $10,000 leap, especially if you're planning on staying purely electric. But the thing is, outside of that comparison, which I think is marginally acceptable, all of the rest of these comparisons between two different electric vehicles or three different electric vehicles, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by focusing on that, and I think we're letting internal combustion engine vehicles off the hook, and that's not where we should be right now. When you start to see these really competitive electric vehicles being released, these no compromise electric vehicles, they should no longer be compared with just any electric vehicle that shares the same drivetrain. They need to be compared with comparable internal combustion engine vehicles, because there are many ways in which electric vehicles are just far superior. In fact, there are really only three ways in which a internal combustion engine vehicle is better. One of them is the energy density of the fuel, so you can just store a lot more energy on board for less weight. The other is the price, clearly. But outside of that, and maybe the refueling time, but those are all arguable. The thing is, these cars can compete against internal combustion engine vehicles at the same level. The Bolt EV especially, the Tesla Model 3 especially. So stop comparing them to other electric vehicles that don't fit the format, that don't fit the branding, that don't fit the price range, it doesn't make sense. So stop letting internal combustion engine vehicles off the hook and start forcing them to have to compete head-to-head against these more compelling electric vehicles. So that's sort of my request of reviewers all across the board. So the next time you have an inclination to review the Bolt EV and compare it to the Smart for 2, just stop. Pull back a second and say, well, maybe I should compare it to the Golf GTI, or maybe I should compare it to the Ford Focus ST, or even the Fiesta ST, as someone pointed out to me, that might be a very comparable car. But again, the Bolt EV there fits directly between the Fiesta ST and the Focus ST in terms of size and performance. So all of a sudden now you have options. When you're comparing the Model 3, don't compare the Model 3 to the Nissan Leaf or the Hyundai Ioniq. Compare it to the BMW 3 Series. Compare it to the A3. Compare it to the Lexus IS Series. So stop comparing electric vehicles to themselves. It's not an isolated market anymore. More and more people are open to the possibility of electric vehicles, and if it's compelling and capable enough for their needs, they'll buy it. So show it off. Okay, so let's talk about those heat pumps. These heat pumps have gained a lot of notoriety, I would say, thanks to the likes of Nissan discussing, how efficient they are, and it's undeniable. As Alex had pointed out in his video, the way they function is essentially an air conditioner in reverse. They take heat from one area and they move it to another area. Now, the reason that's an important concept to understand, that it's moving heat and not actually generating heat, is because it's limited in its effectiveness. So heat pumps are really great at slowly drawing in heat. But what happens is, if the temperatures decrease too much, they're no longer effective. Now, why is that important, and why does that play into these different design principles? So GM did omit the heat pump from the Bolt EV for a reason, and it was only partially, I believe, due to the cost, complexity, size that Alex had referred to in his video. My theory is that it has more to do with different design mentalities. GM is headquartered in Detroit. Detroit is in Michigan. Michigan gets very, very cold in the wintertime. And so if you have a car, say like a Nissan Leaf, with a heat pump, it's very effective between about 35 degrees Fahrenheit and about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything more than 55 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 60 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how cold you get, the difference between a heat pump and using a regular resistance heater is negligible, because you don't actually need to increase the temperature that much to reach a comfortable range. But as you go down the scale of temperature, once you hit the mid-30s in Fahrenheit, there's so little heat to scour from outside the vehicle that a heat pump has to work very, very hard. So even in the case of a Nissan Leaf, the Nissan Leaf needs to supplement its heat pump with an onboard resistive heater. And so as the temperature drops into the 30s, the heat pump starts to decline in usage and the resistance heater starts to increase. As you get below about 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat pump is no longer even working. And that's because there's so little heat to bring in. And remember, you're transferring heat into the cabin of the vehicle, but the cabin of the vehicle is actually expelling heat energy, and that's part of the problem, right? Is you can pump heat in, but that heat is constantly escaping. And so you get to a point where the heat is escaping the cabin just as fast as you're pumping it in. That's why it's no longer as effective. Now, the thing is, with the resistance heater, it works even deeper into that colder temperatures. And when you have a resistance heater the size of the Bolt EVs, which might be actually triple the size of the resistance heater in the Nissan Leaf, it can generate a huge amount of electricity. Now, it does cost you in your battery range because unlike an internal combustion engine vehicle that wastes about 70% of its energy in just heat losses, an electric vehicle is much more efficient. So what happens is the Volt EV's resistance heater is then putting in energy and creating heat through the resistance heater. Now that works far more effectively in cold weather, but at the cost of range. But it might also explain the sort of design differences or design philosophy differences between GM and Nissan and why GM chose not to put the heat pump in. And also it's why I don't necessarily blame GM for not putting the heat pump in. Something that Alex on Autos had mentioned is he's apparently from Northern California. I know the region quite well. Where he is, you don't actually need a heater for most of the year. And so what you're contending with are temperatures in the 40s to the 50s degree Fahrenheit, which is basically what a heat pump was designed for. So if you're going to have a car in a mild climate that doesn't get down into freezing very often, that doesn't have these hard winters, then a heat pump is going to do you a decent amount of good during those mild winter months. But the other thing to remember is, if you have literally double the range, well, it's not going to really matter, right, if you have 40 to 50 degree winters, because those aren't severe enough to actually really impact a car like the Volt EV's range. But that's just my take on the heat pump. Now, with that said, Opel's website recently released a calculator for the Ampera-E and its fuel efficiency during winter time or across different temperatures, but the lowest range for the Ampera-E is what seems to have gotten the most attention. Now, according to that calculator, it's possible to get as little as 104 miles of range out of a Volt EV, or I should say Ampera-E, during severe winter climates. Now, this is going deep into the negative Celsius category. I believe it was as far down as negative 40 degrees Celsius. And it used a cycle that I know I'm going to butcher the name of. It's a Niedrig, but essentially it's a chart. It's much like the EPA's driving cycle that calculates, but the Niedrig chart is the low speed. So essentially what they're saying is, if you turn the heater on to its highest setting in negative 40 degrees Celsius weather and drive it around at a relatively slow speed, you're only going to get 104 miles of range. Well, yes, that's absolutely true. And I believe it represents something like a 64% decrease over the estimated mileage under normal driving circumstances. So why is that important and why is it misleading? Well, it's important because all electric vehicles do lose efficiency during cold weather, but that's true of internal combustion engine vehicles as well. So it's not exclusive to electric vehicles. The problem is when it comes to heating the cabin. So if the Volt EV were driving around in cold weather and you weren't heating the cabin at all, the difference in efficiency between it and an internal combustion engine vehicle would actually be much, much more similar. But the moment you turn on the heater, well, now the Volt EV or the Ampera-E or any of the Tesla models, the Nissan Leaf, all of them are drawing energy out of the battery in order to heat the cabin. Now, that draw is very constant, but what happens is, if you're going faster, that constant draw represents a lower overall amount of your total usage. But if you're going very, very slowly, it increases and becomes a higher percentage relative to your overall energy use. And that's why in this circumstance, I feel it's very important to not just focus on the total range, but focus on the driving time. So in order to achieve only 104 miles of range in that blistering cold weather, it means you'd need to be driving for almost 4 hours. That's a long time to be in a car in those temperatures, in those conditions, driving at a very slow speed. So consider that too when you're thinking about real-world scenarios. How often are you going to want to drive for more than 4 hours in negative 40 degrees Celsius weather, going between 20 and 30, maybe up to 40 miles an hour? Probably not very likely, but it is something to keep in mind. Okay, so the next story is something that was sort of brought to us from across the pond by a British show, The Fully Charged, and it's hosted by Robert Llewellyn Crichton. If you guys have ever watched Red Dwarf, which is, you know, I still get a kick out of. But anyway, so he's very good with electric vehicles, very good with renewable energy, doing reporting from the field, kind of getting his hands dirty and showing things in interviews and doing research. And basically he and his channel is everything I wish I could be. But I do recommend checking out his channel if you're not aware of Fully Charged. It's very good in terms of, like I said, the overall electric vehicle news front and renewable energy front. But this story is more about something that he had showcased earlier last week, which was the Shell recharge program. So apparently Shell is going to start deploying 50 kilowatt charging stations at its different locations throughout Europe. Now, the thing is that's important about that is, well, I mean, it's showing a major oil company that's now starting to invest and diversify their investments in terms of refueling. And it shows, too, to me, the power of consuming wisely. So some people might say to you, well, why are you even bothering with an electric vehicle right now? There are still so many concessions. It's such an emerging technology. But this is an example of why. The primary reason for having an electric vehicle is energy independence, right? It's being able to not have to use a non-renewable energy source just to travel around. So it's environmental, it's about cleaning up the grid, it's about cleaning up the air and the environment. And so if we're now, even with such a small share of the market, having a big enough impact on large oil companies that they say, you know what, we're going to have to start to invest in other energy sources and other refueling options, that's a huge win. It shows that what we're doing is actually having an impact. But a couple of things I have concerns with, right, is you know, it's at a gas station, which a lot of electric vehicle owners have now started to avoid. And these are essentially convenience stores. And they're putting in 50 kilowatt chargers. Well, a 50 kilowatt charger, while it sort of facilitates current electric vehicles, it's nowhere near ideal. If you're going to be putting chargers at a convenience store type location, you really need to be focusing on much faster charging that will allow your customers to get in and out at about 10 to 15 minutes. And so right now, basically what they're doing is, it's this sort of cheap, sort of dipping the toe into the market to see how many people we can get on site and to start, you know, using these chargers. But it is wise, I think, in the fact that they're building that brand. We're already sort of conditioned to look for gas stations when we need to refuel. So if now all of a sudden a gas station's brand is becoming associated with it, refueling points even for electric vehicles, that's a huge win for them. Now, the great thing about electric vehicle charging is it's not exclusive to these gasoline companies. And so if you're a sit-down restaurant owner, if you're a fast food restaurant owner, if you're any sort of a business that wants to increase traffic and you're somewhere near an interstate, somewhere near an exchange, there's nothing restricting you from putting in an electric vehicle charging center, you know. So that's an important difference, right? If a chain restaurant like Denny's or IHOP wants to put in a gas pump, well, You're going to have to dig up the parking lot. You're going to have to get all sorts of permits. You're going to have to put a tank in that has to be replaced every few years. There's, also you're literally pumping a toxic fluid near an eatery. It's not really where you want to be. But if you can run three-phase power through a couple of conduits, and now all of a sudden you can refuel your customers' vehicles while they're eating, well, that's a much bigger win. So I think it's good that Shell is making this transition, but I don't know that their locations are going to be ideal. And if they are going to be ideal, they need to be focusing on much faster charging. And the other thing that was interesting in the video, the interview that Robert conducted, is the Shell representative made a mention about also focusing on destination chargers. Based on recent experiences I've had with long trips, I actually feel like the destination chargers are going to be the real beasts of burden in terms of facilitating a rollout of electric vehicles, because as long as you want to be at the location, you don't need to be fast charging. Especially as long as you want to be at the location for a period of time, whether it be a movie theater or a park or an amusement park or a shopping mall. You don't need to be recharging 200 miles in 30 minutes. But you could recharge 200 miles in 4 hours and still be happy. So that's something to consider. And it's also important to note that while Shell is this big, large company, they haven't really announced any plans to do this domestically in the United States. But there are already companies that are doing it. I personally have charged at a number of different gas stations. There's a 24 kilowatt charger in the Arco station in Vacaville that I've charged at. There's a 24 kilowatt charger in a gas station in Corning that I've used. The Terrible Herbst convenience stores and gasoline pump stations in Nevada, whatever you call those stations that pump gasoline. A lot of them now have chargers. The Maverick gas stations along Highway 15 up through Utah are now adding 50 kilowatt chargers. So Shell isn't the first, and they certainly haven't really announced anything domestically, but it does look like a lot of these gas station and convenience stores along the freeways are catching on. So just a few of those here and there, and it's all that's really going to be necessary for the longer range electric vehicles with fast charging to traverse the country with relative ease. California's Governor Jerry Brown. Now, he had noted in an interview that was published on the BBC that he felt like American automakers were falling behind China in regards to electric vehicle production. But then he goes on to talk about wind, and he goes on to talk about solar and other renewables. And he's not wrong, right, in that China is sort of driving the market. But thus far, no Chinese vehicles really get exported, right? So it's not like they're necessarily a direct threat to domestic auto manufacturers. But I do feel like Jerry Brown might have sort of missed something. A very key story that came out recently was GM's announcement of 20 new all-electric vehicles. Well, the thing is, and that's in the next 5 years, you have VW also announcing a large number of electric vehicles. You have Tesla, who's still pushing that luxury market with electric vehicles and forcing the likes of BMW to respond. So you have these auto manufacturers who are pushing it. Now, again, domestically, you really only have 4 auto manufacturers to speak about, which is essentially, Tesla and GM are the strongest ones in terms of the electric vehicle front. But Ford now is recognizing the error of their ways and having to start developing more their electric vehicle program. Chrysler, you're not exactly sure where they are, but at least they have the Pacifica Hybrid, which is a great option that nobody was addressing. But I do feel like, while Jerry Brown has a valid point right? The concern should probably be more about renewable energy than about the electric vehicles themselves. Because what's going to happen is with China's huge investments, $1 billion outside of their borders that they were investing in renewable energy, it's going to start driving up the price of oil, because no matter how many wars, no matter how much destabilization, no matter how much OPEC wants to try to sell to different countries, if those countries are no longer buying oil, right, the cost of oil is going to start increasing, because there's no demand. You have to sell a smaller amount of it in order to profit, because you're not pulling it out of the ground for free. So that's the aspect of sort of Chinese proposals that are going to have a bigger impact. I actually feel like the U.S. auto industry is addressing this very well. Tesla is going to be building factories in China. GM is clearly targeting BYD with their lineup of electric vehicles. So, I mean, while I somewhat agree with Jerry, I do disagree with him in regards to, I don't think our auto manufacturers are being caught off guard, or at least the only ones that I consider worth noting, again, Tesla and GM, I don't think they're being caught off guard. So, maybe you could say, well, Ford can't get their act together, even though, they're talking about releasing a plug-in hybrid F-150, which will be a good option for some people. But they're really not pushing it, and neither is Chrysler. Those two could, again, face some serious repercussions if all of the European brands and all of the Asian brands and the other two major American brands are pushing electric vehicles so hard that they're forced to catch up. And again, it's not just Chrysler and it's not just Ford. You have Asian manufacturers who are falling asleep at the wheel too. Mazda is a perfect example of it. And even though Mazda and Toyota said that they're going to team up to start building electric vehicles, Toyota said, yeah, but we're not going to share our battery technology with you. Mazda could get caught out in the cold. So, yeah, I don't think it's just the domestic auto manufacturers that need to be worried about evolving. But I do think, yes, Jerry's right, that China is pushing the market forward in terms of electric vehicles, and we're going to start to see those impacts in the next couple of years. Also, another thing to note is that California's rebates for electric vehicles are still sort of in flux, and this discussion from Jerry makes me think that they are going to start pushing much harder for the state rebates, and whether they want to do something like a cash to clunker program or a point of sale that's going to allow lower income buyers to start purchasing electric vehicles. As long as California actually does start to pass those mandates to push electric vehicles further, it really doesn't matter what happens at the federal level. California is already buying the bulk of electric vehicles sold in the United States, and that's only going to push that number higher. So, again, agree, somewhat disagree with Jerry, but it is important to note just how big of an impact China is having at this point. Okay, and one last bonus point before I leave. Last week also had the new Nissan Leaf, and it's being well received in Japan and Europe, so that's a very good sign. The numbers still aren't clear yet, but it appears that as many as 19,000 of them were pre-sold, and now a number of them weren't delivered. Apparently Nissan got in trouble in Japan for not having authorized inspectors, but otherwise they have a lot more that they're going to need to be, or they're going to be delivering in the coming months. Now, while I want to be happy about this, I also want to temper my optimism, because this is also just like the Model 3, where when announced, there's a huge number of people wanting to reserve it. It's that sort of surge, right? Now, if you have tens of thousands of people ordering the Leaf up front, that's great, and I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. But we need to realize that this is a car that's been highly anticipated for a very long time. So that could literally just be 20,000 people who had been waiting 5, 6, 7 months in order to order the new Leaf. So what's going to be more interesting is once that surge is done, how many people are buying it. And so it's giving me a lot of hope going into 2018, because if GM can up their production of the Bolt EV, especially getting those Ampera-E deliveries to Europe, but Tesla can kind of work out what's going on with the Model 3 production right now, and Nissan, who can be a juggernaut when it comes to mass producing cars, can actually get behind this new Nissan Leaf and start pushing it in the US market, but in the international market, we could see massive numbers of electric vehicles sold in 2018, to the point that we really are getting to that tipping point where even if you're not in a very highly populated EV area, people are going to start looking around and seeing electric vehicles up the street, down the street, neighbors driving by quietly or with a pedestrian alarm going. But this is a good sign. So I want to sort of reserve my optimism for a while, but I'm positive. Well, I hope you enjoyed this segment of last week. I'm still working on certain things like the lighting and the sound and the video editing and the turnaround time, and I'm just basically a guy with a job and a video camera and an internet connection and a lot of opinions. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I encourage any sort of discussion and any sort of feedback. We all sort of grow and get better, but be civil about it, and I look forward to next week.